Good evening. Welcome to a TIFF Bell Lightbox. My name is Christoph Straub, and I'm the Senior Manager of Adult Learning here at TIFF. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to tonight's special event, Trek Talks, Space, Diplomacy, and the United Federations of Planets. On behalf of TIFF, I'd like to thank our lead sponsor, Bell, our major sponsors, RBC, L'Oréal Paris, and Visa, and our major public supporters, the Government of Canada, the Government of Ontario, and the City of Toronto. I'd like to acknowledge the Mississaugas of New Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, the original keepers of this land, for hosting us this evening and for hosting TIFF year-round on their territory. Tonight's event is presented in partnership with CBS and the Canadian Space Agency. We'd like to thank these organizations for all of their efforts in making Trek Talks a reality. We'd also like to thank the licensing shop for their help. A big welcome to all of those audiences, not only here in cinema, but also online via our live stream on YouTube and Facebook. Welcome to all of you as well. A few reminders for those of you here in the audience. In cinema, we ask that you please place your phones on silent. Taking photos or recording video is not allowed at any point during the event. However, as you can see, we are capturing the event on professional cameras. During the Q&A, we ask that you wait for a microphone to reach you before asking your question so that our online audience can hear the question as well. Tonight's event is part of our Trek Talks series, one of our major initiatives in celebration of the 50th anniversary of Star Trek. Writer and producer Gene Roddenberry and his collaborators conceived of a future where enhanced technologies, progressive values, and more tolerant social structures were hopeful models of diversity and cooperation. From this starting point, our Trek Talk series features roundtable discussions, keynote presentations that consider the influence of Star Trek in the areas of television, film, technology, space exploration, education, politics, and social justice. And now to tonight's event. Star Trek, the original series, premiered in 1966 at the height of the US-Soviet space race. Instead of fueling the fire of this globe-spanning conflict, its creators opted to offer an alternative to the adversarial ideology. They envisioned a future without inequality, hunger, and disease, and defined by values such as cooperation, tolerance, equality, justice, and liberty for all. Tonight's roundtable discussion of Star Trek, politics, and diplomacy aims to consider what the series can teach us about geopolitics and peace building. And I'm incredibly honored to be joined by three very accomplished speakers tonight, and I'll introduce them now in alphabetical order, starting with Jeremy Hansen. Jeremy Hansen is a modern-day explorer. He began flying at the age of 17, eventually becoming a CF-18 fighter pilot. In 2009, Jeremy was selected from a pool of over 5,300 candidates to become one of 2 Canadian astronauts. Since then, his intensive astronaut training has included geological expeditions to the high Arctic, exploring alien caves, and conducting scientific experiments in weightlessness. Please join me in welcoming Jeremy Hansen. Next up, we have Nicholas Meyer. Nicholas is an award-winning writer and director whose screenplay for the feature film, The 7% Solution, was nominated for an Academy Award. He co-wrote and directed 2 entries in the Star Trek film series, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. In addition, he co-wrote the 4th entry in the series, Voyage Home. His other directorial credits include Time After Time, The Day After, The Deceivers, Company Business, and Vendetta. He's currently working on the new CBS Star Trek television series. Please join me in welcoming Nicholas Meyer. And last but certainly not least, Margaret Weidekamp is a curator in the Space History Department at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. She obtained a BA from the University of Pittsburgh and a PhD from Cornell University. Margaret oversees over 4,500 individual pieces of space memorabilia and space science fiction objects, including the 11-foot studio model of the original Star Trek Starship Enterprise. Yes. Her book, Right Stuff, Wrong Sex, America's First Women in Space Program, won the Eugene M. Emmy Award for Astronautical Literature from the American Astronautical Society. Please join me in welcoming Margaret Weidekamp. All right. So, politics, diplomacy in Star Trek is obviously a huge topic that I don't think we'll be able to cover in the next 60 minutes. That's why we decided to hone in on maybe, let's say, 3 main questions or themes. I'll just bring them out now. First up, we want to talk about the role that diplomacy plays in Star Trek, the original series, and how does this approach to politics distinguish Star Trek from other television shows at the time? Secondly, how has the role of politics and diplomacy changed a little bit in different iterations of Star Trek, such as The Next Generation and Voyager? And last but not least, which elements of Star Trek, the Star Trek philosophy, are reflected in the mandates of space organizations such as NASA or the Canadian Space Agency, and in general, the international collaboration on space exploration? So with that, I want to start with a very general question for all of our panelists, actually. And I want to ask them, what is the purpose of diplomacy, and what are some of the fundamentals of diplomatic relations, and in your opinion? And I want to start maybe with Margaret, and we'll work our way towards Jeremy.
Well, I was really struck by the relevance of this topic because as we just had 50th anniversary events at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum for the 50th anniversary of Star Trek, I actually had a woman come up to me who was a part of the U.S. Foreign Service, U.S. Diplomatic Corps, and she was pointing out that she's always loved Star Trek because it's one of the few fictional representations of diplomacy, of the ways that nations maintain a civilian corps who have a presence in their own country and in countries around the world to really foster those relationships. And from a close friend of mine who's in the Foreign Service, it really thinks about it in terms of taking care of those people. And I think that that's part of what you see reflected in Star Trek, is not just a military set of expeditions heading out to conquer, but a corps that is trying to bring a philosophy of inclusion and of fruitful contact with other species, other worlds, as they imagine it in that space context.
Mm-hmm. Okay. How about you, Nicholas? What do you think is the purpose of diplomacy and some of maybe the key ingredients?
Well, there's a very important sort of caveat that I think we have to sort of get out of the way, and that is that the assumption of Star Trek is that you can talk to everybody. But there are science fiction depictions, and conceivably, we don't know if there are life in other planets, or, but it may not necessarily be humanoid life. I don't know if you saw this, what I thought was terrific, Tom Cruise picture called Edge of Tomorrow. Was a stupid title, but these were not creatures that you could like talk to. So the Star Trek assumption, and it isn't, shows its earthbound sort of significance and orientation, is that you sooner or later you can talk to anybody. And talk is pretty good. It's preferable. Somebody said the first man to make a fist is the man who's run out of ideas. And speaking as someone who is an inherently peaceful person and interested in not killing, I think that's a really good example. I don't think I can add significantly otherwise to what Margaret outlined.
Okay, that's pretty good. Not killing people is, I think, a very important ingredient of diplomacy. How about you, Jeremy?
The thought that comes to mind for me is the fact that in any diplomatic relations is listening to the other side. It's like diplomatic relations with my wife. It's understanding that there are two points of view, and that both of us have, I guess, desires, things that we're interested in, and that you need to listen. You need to understand what the other person or the other nation is requiring or is asking of you, and then finding the middle ground, or exchanging what can be exchanged to make.
Have you decided
happy.
to open an embassy near your wife someday?
Is it that far already? No, hopefully not.
Who do you represent? Oh, I represent the wife. Yes.
But what drives us to have diplomatic relations?
Well, it's a way, I think, of avoiding bloodshed. That's certainly the history of diplomacy is an effort to not kill each other and to see if there are not compromises or other ways of settling arguments or differences or differing needs. This is, you should pardon the expression, it's not rocket science. And people from, it's very interesting to read about the Congress of Vienna, 1815, that after Napoleon was finally defeated and Europe had to be remade for the first time, everybody met in Vienna to try to carve out solutions. And sometimes those solutions were better than others. Everybody, I think, now agrees that the Treaty of Versailles at the end of the First World War was so seriously flawed that it led to the Second World War. And it's not just treaties, obviously, but border disputes and all kinds of things that people having talk is better in that regard than fighting. I think it all comes back to that.
And I think part of what's interesting, it comes down to people, and it requires that personal contact. And I think that Star Trek is one of the places where, in a fictional world set off in this kind of space context that allows us to defamiliarize it, to think about it in a new way, they're depicting ambassadors, and that these very big, complex geopolitical relationships often come down to personal relationships and the personal abilities of two people or a group of people sitting in a room to come to some understanding and be understood.
Right, you touched upon something that I want to elaborate on a little bit, which is science fiction as a genre really lends itself to political and social commentaries, more so than any other genre, maybe. Why do you think is that the case? And maybe I'll start with you, Nicholas, because I think you have written, obviously, several films, science fiction films, novels as well.
Well, I'm not an expert on I'm not an expert. We've yet to find something that I'm an expert on, but I'm no expert about this. But I do think that if you can set something in another time or place, and it doesn't have to be science fiction either. I was talking to somebody earlier today, and I said that when the Red Scare happened in America in the 50s, and we were finding communists under every bed and burning people at the stake, Arthur Miller wrote a play set during the Salem witch trials called The Crucible, which was also in a way meant to objectify a contemporary experience in such a way that it could be looked at from with some kind of distance. Mm-hmm. And by calling, for example, the Klingons the Russians, you might be able to look at their dilemma. That's what my movie Star Trek VI was certainly all about. Looking at it without pressing a button that made it impossible for someone to see it because it's something so close up and so much we're in the middle of it, that by setting it in outer space or setting it 400 years ago or something, you have a chance to look more dispassionately, more objectively at it and contemplate what different sides are saying or require.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. A question for Jeremy and Margaret. One thing you touched upon as well is the USS Enterprise is actually a military ship, right? It is, and its crew members are not necessarily scientists nor are they diplomats. that being said, they're often thrust into situations that require diplomacy. Do you see any parallels, if there are any, between that premise of the show and such real-life organizations as NASA and the Canadian Space Agency in your everyday life, even in your work at the CSA? Maybe we'll start with you, Jeremy.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm an astronaut with the Canadian Space Agency, and I'm posted down to NASA, so I live and work at the Johnson Space Center, and I see many parallels. Do we look? Our goal is to explore new places. Right now we're getting a foothold in low Earth orbit because this is a great place for us to learn and do science and research, and prepare ourselves to explore further out beyond low Earth orbit, to go to places like Mars in the future, and. Our mandate at the Canadian Space Agency is the peaceful use of outer space. It's part of our mandate. And I think that, you mentioned it, the Enterprise is a war vessel or a military vessel, but I never really thought of it that way. I'm not even sure that it is. I mean, it's an armed vessel, but it only ever goes out with the intention of self-defense. It has no purpose that it is ever going to go conquer. That in the series that I watched, that never happens. So it has weapons for self-defense only. Now, luckily, fortunately for us at the Canadian Space Agency and the International Space Station, we don't have any use for weapons or any need for weapons, and that's a great thing. And the other part of our mandate is to learn, essentially, and to bring back value to society, so social and economic benefits. So that's how we rate or judge everything that we're looking at as opportunities for research, et cetera, in space. We look at it, is it going to bring social and economic benefit? And if we believe it will, then we support that. That's our mandate.
Mm-hmm. And what is it like on the NASA side, maybe from your perspective?
Well, I think historically, NASA was formed in 1958 out of the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, which was a civilian research organization. But President Dwight Eisenhower does that in the wake of the Soviet Sputnik in October of '57. Really with an eye of creating a civilian organization, although it has the personnel and the structures and things are very much informed by military structure. And I think the kind of dual uses that Jeremy started to allude to of both the military's historic role in exploration and in peacekeeping as well as in warfare. I think you see that in the way that NASA is structured. In the United States, it's very much, and we were just talking about this a little bit, there were a lot of intra-service rivalries between, the Army thought that they were going to be in charge of human spaceflight. The Air Force was sure that they were going to be in charge of human spaceflight, and in fact did not give up on a human spaceflight program until the late 1960s. They kept a human spaceflight corps for the Manned Orbiting Laboratory. And so there were a lot of rivalries about, would the Navy be in charge, would the Air Force be in charge, would the Army be in charge? And part of what Eisenhower does then, it says, none of you guys get it. We're creating this new civilian organization. And I think in some ways when Roddenberry and is working with folks in creating Star Trek in the mid-1960s, he's thinking about that and kind of extrapolating forward. So what if you took that, this organization that had somewhat military roots and diplomatic roots of saying that, it comes out of a coalition of planets, rather than just nations, and kind of threw that forward into the future in our most kind of optimistic vision of who we could be. It was a really bold vision in the mid-1960s in the depths of the Cold War to envision a time when humanity could exceed that, when we could move past that, and then when you could have men and women working together in a moment when the women's movement is just beginning, that you could have people of different races and different nationalities on a space crew at a time that's in the middle of the American Civil Rights Movement and when there's a lot of strife around the world. So I think he's taking some of those visions and really trying to extrapolate them forward to an optimistic vision of what if we could bring the best of ourselves into the future.
This is great, yeah. So I want us to keep in mind some of these themes that we just discussed, which is peace building, exploration, learning, as we now delve into the Star Trek universe. I'm going to start with Star Trek, the original series, and we'll show a first clip here. This is a clip from an episode called Errand of Mercy, which aired towards the end of season 1. And to set it up, Captain Kirk and Spock are trapped on a planet that is invaded by the Klingons and inhabited by the Organians, a civilization widely perceived to not have evolved for thousands of years. So in this scene, Kirk and the Klingon commander are interrupted in the middle of a heated argument by two of the counselors of the Organians, who it turns out may be much more evolved and wiser than Kirk and Spock had anticipated. So let's take a look at this clip.
We find interference in other people's affairs most disgusting. But you gentlemen have given us no choice.
You should be the first to be on our side. 200 hostages killed.
No one has been killed, Captain.
No one has died here in uncounted thousands of years.
You're liars. You're meddling in things that are none of your business. Or our empire, how to handle their interstellar relations. We have the right.
To wage war, Captain? To kill millions of innocent people? To destroy life on a planetary scale? Is that what you're defending?
Well, no one wants war. But there are proper channels. People have a right to handle their own affairs. Eventually, we wouldn't.
Oh, eventually you will have peace, but only after millions of people have died. It is true that in the future, you and the Klingons will become fast friends. You will work together.
Never.
Your emotions are most discordant. We do not wish to seem inhospitable, but gentlemen, you must leave.
Yes, please leave us. The mere presence of beings like yourselves is intensely painful to us.
Okay. Sorry for the slightly technical problems, but I think we caught the main theme of this clip. And I would like to ask Margaret, maybe, you started actually talking a little bit about the historical context of the series as well. But how did this context influence the main themes, plot lines of the series, and in general, but in this scene in particular, maybe? What do we see here?
Well, I think that part of what's powerful about television and this kind of storytelling is the ability to evoke those contexts that, with some well-chosen phrases there, they're very clearly throwing into relief the questions of the Cold War in ways that I thought, when in Star Trek VI, the first scenes where they're setting up the beginning of that, and I think we may get to that in a little bit, you can clearly see allusions to the ends of the Cold War in a way that a contemporary audience would pick up on. And I think that the ability to have some contemporary context reflected in this way in a fictional vision is part of what kept a really passionate niche audience coming back to the original series, which didn't do widely well in 3 seasons on NBC, but did very narrowly well in a way that garnered an audience that pushed hard for it to come back in the 1970s and then was a really avid audience for the films and other TV series. So I think the ability to draw on those larger contexts and tell those bigger stories to get people thinking was a powerful part of what they were doing.
And Nicholas, I know you were not an avid watcher of the original series, but were there any other television series at the time that did tackle such political issues that you know of?
Well, I was not a big television. Well, I mean, I watched Perry Mason or something, but I could never figure out who did it. So I can't speak intelligently to that.
Okay, no worries. what, in your opinion, though, are the risk and the benefit of making a television series, or a film for that matter, that deals with such political issues and that could become hot button issues for the public, or, you know?
Well, I think art has many functions. Tolstoy said that the purpose of art is to teach you to love life. But it is also, I think, to ask questions, much more than to answer them, incidentally, is to put things out there. It doesn't have to be science fiction. There's all kinds of ways to portray human dilemmas. Aristotle said that we like to look at imitations of ourselves. And that's what a lot of art is. It's whether you're looking at paintings or listening to music, you are listening to reflections and refractions of ourselves, of the human species, and to raise questions, to give you things to think about. Human beings are very good at coming up with solutions and answers. Sometimes I think it's much more important to figure out not what the right answer is, but what the right question is. The one that's going to lead to the better answer, the better solution, to define what problems are by investigating them in dramatic terms. And I think movies are very good at doing that, and television is very good at doing that. Whether you're talking about Law and Order episodes, or 7 Days in May, or The Grapes of Wrath, I mean, or the plays of Shakespeare are probably the best.
Okay. We'll get to Shakespeare in a second, because I know it plays an integral part, actually, of your film as well.
He writes the best dialogue. And it's free.
But a question I wanted to ask all of you, actually, because it is a prevalent theme in that episode, and of course in the first series, which is what is the purpose of the United Federation of Planets, and then in particular one of its main principles, the Prime Directive. And Jeremy, maybe I'll start with you here, and we'll work our way towards Margaret.
Yeah, so in my mind, the primary principle is cooperation. And it's the concept that you can do more together than you can as individuals. And that's something that we're seeing in our space program today. I mean, we're not there yet. We're in the initial steps of this, but we have the International Space Station. And the impetus of that space station, started out as 2 space stations. It was the Russian space station Mir 2 and the American space station Freedom. And the reality was neither of those space stations were likely to come to fruition due to budgetary reasons. And so this was the impetus to create an international cooperation to do something that wasn't going to happen otherwise, and then invite other partners. And that's now why we have the Russians, the Americans, Japanese, Canadians, and then the entire European Space Agency, which is many, many countries, working together in space. And that's how I view the Federation, is almost like a United Nations style of body, but to bring cooperative efforts together so you can accomplish more than you can independently.
Can I ask a question? Did you watch Star Trek when you were a kid, and did that influence your choice of profession?
It did. I wanted to be an astronaut before I saw Star Trek, I think, in my mind. I just made this decision very early on, so some of that stuff's kind of fuzzy. But I saw the Apollo images, which really inspired me. I said I wanted to be an explorer. I remember watching a little bit of the first series, but in high school, which is well after I made the decision to be an astronaut and a fighter pilot, I was hooked on The Next Generation. And I was largely influenced by Picard and his leadership style, and it really resonated with me, and it really inspired me.
So, Nicholas, what do you think of the Prime Directive?
Just remind me what it is.
It is the Prime Directive basically forbids the Federation or Enterprise crew to interfere or intervene with any alien civilizations that they encounter on their travels. It's
I think I'm
let them
rather
develop
cynical about
independently.
when I watched the Star Trek thing, and maybe I'm going to bring the house down about my ears, but it looked like a species of gunboat diplomacy to me, in which at the end of the day, the American way was the best way. And, living through Vietnam, that kind of pissed me off, because it didn't look like such a good way to me. So I looked at Star Trek at the time through that lens, which was a sort of semi-hypocritical lens. You know, I thought the scariest words were "we come in peace," and I immediately I started to get very nervous when people say "we come in peace." I thought, okay, in peace or pieces? How does that really going to work? So I've had to sort of come around the long way to the notion of what you're talking about and the benefits, and to see it in a less cynical, less chauvinistic light. I'm the last person to understand anything, trust me.
Margaret, what about you?
Well, I think it really draws on a long aspirational history of wanting to have international cooperation, a League of Nations, a United Nations, organizations that would really allow all of these different cultures and groups to come together. I also think it's a really useful narrative trick or tool for, because it's very, very hard to do, right? Part of the point of the Prime Directive comes up because they're just always on the edge of violating it, right? Like it's just, someone always has to kind of whip out the rule book and say, no, wait a minute. We have rules. We said we wouldn't do this. And I think that the practical considerations of trying to bring different cultures, different languages, different ways of being together are really challenging. And if I can turn it very slightly, I've just been doing some research in the NASA archives and looking actually at the creation of the International Space Station. And when if you think kind of writ large these questions of, say, bringing a former Soviet Union and the United States and Japan and Europe and Canada together to build, one international space station that could be continually occupied since the year 2000. When they started, I mean, literally the U.S. and the Russians didn't breathe the same air, right? You can't go to Europe and just plug in your hairdryer. You'll blow so you don't have the same currents, you don't have the same keyboards, you don't have the same language. The languages don't use the same alphabets. Trying to standards for water purity. I mean, all kinds of, whose language do you use for the emergency signage? When you have something that is going to, when you need quick directions, whose language is primary? Are you going to have all of those things in 6 different languages? So I think that, part of the Prime Directive comes up because when you really start to grapple with what does it take to bring all of these different groups together, respecting those differences, then that's a real challenge. And I think that in the Star Trek universe, the Prime Directive serves both as a kind of aspiration that has these deep historical antecedents, but at the same time as in the structure of the show, it's a great dramatic tool because you're always going to start to run up against how do the practicalities run into these aspirations?
Yeah, it's nice in that scene, actually, you see Captain Kirk catching himself, taking a deep breath and pulling himself back, right? It's literally, actually. Mm-hmm. I want to touch upon something that Nicholas briefly brought up at the beginning, which is the fact that conveniently everyone speaks English in Star Trek, especially the original series. Jeremy, this is a question for you. How are astronauts trained on the etiquette and ethics of first contact with alien civilizations?
Yeah, so to date, we haven't needed to be trained for the situation of first contact, and we're not trained at all. Okay. In fact, I was, I was an X-Files fan as well in university, and I wanted to believe. I was Mulder, and secretly, I was hoping that when I became a fighter pilot and was holding alert, you sleep in the hangar with an armed jet and ready to go up and intercept unidentified objects, and I was really hoping that, on that first shift, it'd be like, hey, it's time to come in the room and find out the truth, and it never happened. And so, no, we're not trained at all on first contact. Now, kids ask me all the time, Canadians ask me all the time, do I believe there's alien life? And I certainly, I don't disbelieve, but I certainly haven't seen any proof. But it is an interesting concept to ponder. What would that be like? Can we assure ourselves that a civilization that's that advanced will have figured out that it's better to be peaceful and they'll come? Sorry, I don't mean to make you nervous, but they'll come in peace? Can we be assured of that? And I don't know. I don't know the answer. I mean, it's like you said, it's a good question to ask ourselves, and science fiction has helped us ask that question, including Star Trek has helped us ask that question.
Don't forget that H.G. Wells completely reversed the whole idea. The Martians invade us, and nothing stops them except bacteria in the end. The one thing they had, but you couldn't reason with these people with their death ray and whatever. They were going to simply overtake the planet until God in his infinite wisdom destroyed them with the humblest thing that, the microbes. And I thought that was a really interesting switch on the way we always, well, now, of course, with Independence Days, and we're always being invaded. And if you listen to Donald Trump, it's always by illegal aliens.
Yeah.
Right. I was wondering when he would come up in this debate. So
I keep
40
checking.
minutes.
I keep
Yes.
checking my phone to see how he's going down.
Okay. You can stay here. We'll keep you in Canada.
Believe me, I once moved away from America when somebody else was elected, and I said, I can't do this anymore. After 8 years of Ronald Reagan, when the first George Bush was elected, I moved to London.
Oh.
Then I only had to contend with Maggie Thatcher, so I wound up moving.
All right.
I'm always on the move.
Back to the topic. I want to actually, so the films now of Star Trek carry on the torch of the original series to a certain extent, but they also break with the series and portray, for instance, the end of the Federation Klingon rivalry in Star Trek VI. Next up, we have a clip from this very film, which was co-written and directed by Nicholas. And to set it up, after the destruction of one of their mining planets and main energy sources, the Klingons begin peace talks with the Federation. In this scene, the Klingon Chancellor Gorkon and his delegation are on board the Enterprise for a diplomatic dinner that is headed up by Captain Kirk, rather reluctantly, I would say. This is not the full dinner scene. We have about 90 seconds. I'm sorry, Nicholas, but it does feature a very beautiful long shot at the beginning. We can't show that, but the second half of the dinner. So let's roll that clip. Beautifully written and stolen from Shakespeare. But Nicholas,
Let's not leave out the directing, huh?
yes, of course, the directing. Could you tell us a little bit more about what the purpose is of this dinner scene in the larger context of the film, and how did you conceive it?
Well, it's sort of, I think, dangerous to ask artists to explain themselves. Somebody said to Margot Fontaine after the ballet, "Oh, Dame Margot, I so enjoyed your dancing. Tell me, what were you doing up there?" And she said, "I'm very sorry. I explained what I was doing while I was doing it. If you didn't understand me, then I failed." I think the dinner scene was an attempt to represent diplomacy between two blind opposing cultures and to point out the difficulties of communicating across that gulf. Half the time I notice in my own country, we can't even agree on what the topic is that we're discussing. So, for example, one half will say, well, this is about a woman's right to choose. And the other half says, no, this is about murder. What is the middle ground? Where is the diplomatic no man's land in which two points of view so diametrically opposed? And right now, John Kerry and Sergei Lavrov, his Soviet counterpart, are trying to ostensibly, what?
Russian.
Russian. Did I say Soviet?
We'll catch up.
We'll edit that out
I
later.
really got to watch the original series. Are trying to, to figure out some rapprochement or compromise on Syria, but they want completely different things. And there is a point at which, and this is maybe fatalistic on my part, diplomacy breaks down. And somebody does run out of ideas and does make a fist because they can't think of anything else to do. And in my most cynical and fatalistic frame of mind, I say, well, what has changed about the human race since the time of cave people? Is that when you run out of ideas, somebody grabs a stick or a rock or pushes a button or does something, because we can't figure it out. Have we gotten past any basic human emotions, love, hate, jealousy? Have we improved, or if we just added technology to the arsenal of stuff that we resort to when things go wrong, when we can't get past ourselves, when we can't resolve our differences? And it's a depressing thought. It's also a scary thought.
But they do find common ground, even in the dinner scene, right?
Yeah, we just haven't found it in Syria.
Right, that's true. But for, they find common ground in Shakespeare. They talk about you have never experienced Shakespeare until you've heard or read him in Klingon.
In the original Klingon, yes.
Right.
Actually, I was sent here to ask you, I have a colleague who does stuff with the Pop Culture Happy Hour at NPR and wants to know, who wrote that line? It's a great line.
I wrote
You
it.
wrote the line.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
I wrote most of the movie. The line is a paraphrase of what the Nazis said. You've never heard Shakespeare until you've heard him in the original German, or that he sounds better in German. German and English are related in ways, for example, that English and French are not. The French are notoriously indifferent to Shakespeare for many reasons, although it sounds pretty cool to me in French, but the French don't get it in the same way the Germans get it.
One thing you also mentioned just right now with technology as something that furthers, that can be a danger to peace or to diplomacy. But Jeremy, for instance, can you think of technology as a way of diplomacy as well? Something that can be shared or something that can actually further conversations with other nations?
Yeah, absolutely. There are two thoughts on that. One is that this is exactly what we do in the International Space Station. I'm sorry I keep bringing that up, but that's kind of where I live. It's the world I live in, and this is the currency that we exchange primarily is technology, and not always technologies that another partner couldn't create on their own. But we divide up the tasks, and so we say to Canada, you will provide the robotic systems for the space station. It's not that Russians or the Americans or Japanese or Europeans couldn't create that technology too. They could, but it's one that we have a niche technology, so we provide the robotics. And right now the Russians provide the method of transportation to get to the space station. And so we trade and we deal in a currency of technology. And this is diplomacy. This is allowing us to work together to leverage each other's areas of expertise, capabilities, and for each country to pay their portion of it. The other side of technology, when I think about it, a little bit counter to your fear, and I appreciate those comments, but it's getting harder and harder to not find middle ground as our communication system on this planet improves. And I was speaking about that earlier, but that is what gives me the most hope, is that we are getting better at communicating around this globe, and it is getting harder to keep people in boxes. And the more you talk to people, the more you travel, the more that you go and see them, and you realize that you and I can sit down at that dinner table, and you didn't know me a few hours ago, but now we know each other, and I know you're human, and I'm human, and at the basic core level, we're the same. And anywhere I go in the world, I have that exact same experience. And that gives me great hope that communication system is ultimately, we're going to get better at using it. I think right now we're fairly poor at using it, but we are going to get better at using it to find that diplomatic middle ground.
Let me ask a question apropos of what you're saying. And this has to do with the internet. Because it seems to me that it used to be possible to people to have private conversations in which strategy or ideas could be exchanged in an unself-conscious way out of the public eye, which might prove useful, and you might try out scenarios in private which, for whatever reason, you wouldn't wish to make public. Now, it's very, very hard to have a secret. And the internet seems to me sometimes to simply reinforce hardline prejudices that are where it's so open to misinterpretation. Things that were meant to sort of trial balloons only to be shot down, or suddenly say, did you really, contemplate X, Y, and Z? And I think a lot of sort of crazy people come out and sort of pitchfork wielders, thanks to the internet, and everybody hacks everybody else's private stuff. And is that helpful? Has technology helped?
Well, if I
wouldn't-
may.
Yeah, you go ahead.
on, Jim.
Well, and this is, I said, I think we're doing a poor job of using that system, and that's exactly what I mean, is that you can go on the internet with a bias or consume modern media with any bias and often find justification for your point of view. And my hope is that as we get better at using the communication system, that we'll identify methods to actually prioritize our problems and prioritize the suggested solutions to the point where people do get real education from that communication system and not just propaganda.
One of the core principles of history of technology, one of Mel Kranzberg's rules, is that technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And that's really where you start, with the complexity of that and the human uses of that, and that as a conscientious historian, when whether we're looking at communications technologies or space technologies, and as we're trying to think about them and contextualize them, in my case at the museum at the Smithsonian, that we're trying to keep that complexity in the equation and keep it historically grounded and be aware of the ways that the technology itself is not inherently good or bad. But it's not neutral either, and it's very much used for these purposes in very human ways.
That's a good answer. Yeah, thank you.
This is why you bring an historian.
Yeah. I do want to move now from the original series to Next Generation. And again, I'd like to show a clip, this time from the episode Unification Part 2, which aired as part of Season 5. Chronologically, actually, this episode nicely dovetails with some of the themes explored in the Undiscovered Country. To set it up, Captain Picard and his crew learned that Spock, who is now an ambassador of the Federation, has been seen on Romulus, an arch enemy of the Vulcan people, and the Federation at large. As it turns out, Spock has been trying to discern if an alleged ally in the Romulan Senate can indeed help him end the warlike status quo between Vulcans and Romulans. So in this scene, Captain Picard, who is in disguise as a Romulan, confronts Spock about his unusual diplomatic approach. Let's roll the scene.
What are you doing on Romulus? That was to have been my question of you, sir. It is no concern of Starfleet. On the contrary, it is very much Starfleet's concern. You're in a position to compromise the security of the Federation. You may assure your superiors, Captain, that I am here on a personal mission of peace, and I will advise Starfleet when it is appropriate. That is not satisfactory. You cannot remain here, Captain Picard. And I will not return without a full explanation. Ambassador, with great respect for all that you've achieved on behalf of the Federation, this sort of cowboy diplomacy will not easily be tolerated anymore. Cowboy diplomacy? If you wish to undertake a mission with obvious repercussions for the Federation, then you should discuss it with the Federation. I'm here as their representative. You'll have to discuss it with me. That is precisely what I had hoped to avoid.
Okay, I'll start with Margaret here. Using this clip as a starting point, could you tell us what are some of the distinguishing characteristics of the next generation's portrayal of politics and diplomacy? And how do they differ maybe from the original series?
Well, I think it's striking that the phrase cowboy diplomacy, right? Because especially in the original series, Captain Kirk is a bit of a kind of an old style gunslinger, bit of a captain, and Captain Picard, has an empath on his crew, right? Captain Kirk doesn't care what people are feeling, right? This is a very different set of basic concerns that I think reflects some shifts and some differences, perhaps out of a kind of deeply Cold War mindset, but especially in the American context, that idea of the Western, that trope of expansion and exploration, often at the point of a gun, with the Western motif, is something that I think was very powerful in the ways that space science fiction was figured in, from Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon through to Star Trek. And I think you see the next generation writers and directors starting to deliberately play with and push against that model.
Let's talk maybe a little bit about the difference, more about the differences between Captain Kirk and Captain Picard. And Jeremy, what did appeal? You said you're the next generation guy. What did appeal to you about Captain Picard in particular?
Yeah, I always felt like he was modeling the best of humanity in general, in that, in values that I was being taught, growing up, that were important. Valuing other people is something that I always, as an air cadet, one of the missions of the Air Cadet program, which is a youth program for the ages of 12 to 18, is to create good Canadian citizens. And what we valued was other people, their contribution and the recognition that they brought an important aspect to society. And I always felt like Picard demonstrated that in all of his dealings, and that he went out with the very clear intent of listening to the other side and bringing value, I guess, to any relationships that they formed.
And one thing about the next generation is that they introduce a new type of opponent, the Borg. And this opponent is not interested in diplomacy at all. What do you guys make of the Borg when you first saw them appear on the series? Maybe starting with you again, Jeremy, and then...
Yeah, it's a very interesting dilemma because, it ties into something we were talking about earlier. I mean, where you can't communicate really with them. There's not really any communication to be had here. It's just our way or the highway kind of mentality. And how do you suddenly? What do? You can value other species as much as you want, but if they don't share that as a part of their Prime Directive, then you're left to use your defensive weapons at that point. And that's what we really saw in those episodes, that it's, wow, we're outgunned here, we're outmatched, and they're not talking, and we're not used to dealing with this type of situation.
How about you, Margaret?
Oh, I thought they were a great villain. I mean, just very entertaining television, very good in the movies, because there was one of the things with episodic television is you get used to the idea that more or less by the end of the hour, you're going to be able to reset, right? You can kind of see by the time you're getting to the second or third commercial that we're starting to turn a corner and we're going to be able to figure this out. And I thought that part of what was so effective about the Borg was this sense, that the Federation may have run up against something that they couldn't work their way around. That they had actually written a very, formidable villain that didn't telegraph easy ways in which, by the end of the hour, we were going to be able to reset. And I thought that was, as a scholar of popular culture, when I'm looking at these things, part of what I enjoy is being able to see the ways that the narrative power of the Star Trek franchise really, in very nice ways, builds because it continues to evolve. and it reflects its time as it changes. But it also then means that, you know, when you get a film like Star Trek VI, you're drawing on years of fans' familiarities with these characters that allows you to have, you know, a raised eyebrow that carries great significance around a dinner table in a way that if we had just been introduced to these folks, it doesn't have, you know that your viewers have the years of familiarity. And I thought that the Borg was a nice evolution of having gone through years of relatively easily, you know, defeated or outmaneuvered villains, and then really coming up against being able to write something that was formidable and really was going to be very hard for them to work their way through or around. And that's just a lot of fun to watch.
Yeah. Nicholas, were you familiar with the Borg at all? Did you care about them as a... Will they make a return in the new series?
If I told you, I'd have to kill you.
Okay, I won't ask anymore. That was very convincing. But going back...
One thing is sort of, it occurs to me listening that it's also true that all the television series, as near as I can figure out, are sort of revolve around a sort of nation-state concept of alien civilizations. That it's a tribe or a group. One thing that I find very troubling about the world in which we currently find ourselves, and Star Trek VI is a little bit smug at the end. Kirk says, you know, people can be very frightened of change, like those Federation and Klingon collaborators who were trying to prevent the peace talk from being successful were sort of scaredy cats, that they were frightened of the future. And at the same time, we were all rejoiced at the end of the USSR and the brave new world that we were all convinced we were entering into. And Francis Fukuyama said, have we reached the end of history? And so forth. And I ask myself, are we better now when you've got, you know, crazy people running around as individuals, one of whom will sooner or later put an atom bomb in a suitcase and leave it in the train station? That is a scarier thought to me than even that eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation with the Soviet Union that was, when we each had, you know, 10,000 nuclear weapons, enough to kill every man, woman, and child on the face of the earth 54 times over. Was that actually preferable to what we have now, when nation states are not the issue? It's about, you know, individuals or small groups of individuals who have, or increasingly have, loose nukes at their disposal, or able to create them, people blowing themselves up in public places anywhere in the world.
Yeah, that is indeed a scary thought. And
How can you have diplomacy if there's no one on the other side to diplome with?
And I think as Star Trek series continue, they explored some of these questions as well. I mean, taking Voyager for an example, in this series we have the Star Trek ship Voyager stranded in a far-off quadrant of the galaxy. They're no longer in Federation territory, and they're faced with very different situations than the crews of Next Generation or the original Star Trek series. I do want to show a clip from Voyager before we hand it over to the audience. And this clip is it's from an episode called The Void, towards the end of the season. And the Voyager has been sucked into a large vortex and parallel universe that has stranded hundreds of other starships. And the crews of these starships are now hunting each other for valuable equipment and food in order to survive. So in this clip, we have Captain Janeway discussing with her main officers the Voyager's options in this peculiar situation and how to react. So let's take a look at that clip.
We want to be clear about what our policy is going to be while we're here in the void. You think we should have taken Valen's food?
Logic suggests we may have to be more opportunistic if we intend to survive.
We may not like Valen's tactics, but he and his crew are still alive after 5 years in here.
I was thinking about that myself. I thought maybe I could get some guidance from the Federation Charter. I was hoping I'd find a loophole that would allow us to take actions we ordinarily wouldn't take.
Any luck?
The Charter's a statement of principles, not a practical document.
No section on how to exist in a void.
No. But I've become convinced that we've got to stick to our principles, not abandon them.
Should the crew be ready to die for those principles?
If the alternative means becoming thieves and killers ourselves, yes. But I'm betting that our principles are going to keep us alive.
Captain.
The Federation is based on mutual cooperation. The idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Voyager can't survive here alone. But if we form a temporary alliance with other ships, maybe we can pool our resources and escape.
As you pointed out, the people we've encountered in this void are thieves and killers. Such individuals are hardly ideal allies.
I agree.
Then who are we going to form an alliance with?
Anyone who agrees to play by our rules. No killing, no stealing, and no giving up.
Nicholas, you had mentioned that you really like Captain Janeway as a captain. What appeals to you about her leadership style?
I'm not a very analytical person, so it's a visceral response. There's just something about her as somebody in command that I inherently respect. And I don't know if it's the actress or what, but there's a kind of decisiveness to her that seems less touchy-feely than Picard and less swashbuckly than Captain Kirk. What do I know?
Jeremy and Margaret, does her argument here make sense to you? Like, is cooperation in this case the way to go?
Yeah, absolutely. It makes perfect sense to me. And it's idealistic, of course. It doesn't mean it's going to work, but it's a great starting point. And it's where it's bringing the best concept of us to the situation and hoping that will work. And you can't be sure that you would be successful with that. But that's what diplomacy here on Earth is about. It's about forming the partnerships. It's about realizing that, she said some of the same words that I was discussing before, is that we can do more together than we could individually. It's why we have that International Space Station, because there's a realization we can't afford to do this on our own. And as we go to take our next steps in space exploration, we have now realized the benefits of this international cooperation. All of the partners of the International Space Station firmly believe that the path forward, the most probable path of success forward, is for us to continue and expand the cooperative efforts in space exploration. And here's the thing, and this is what she's talking about there. You need to set a goal that's big enough to bring in that alliance, and that's what she's saying. Right now they're just trying to, seemingly, I didn't watch this show, seemingly they're just trying to survive. That's everybody's goal, an independent goal. And what she's saying is, hey, we're going to set a bigger goal, a goal big enough to unite people. We're going to set the goal of escaping the void. And we're going to sell that goal to other people who want to embrace it and give them that hope, that vision, that if we work together, we may actually be able to find a solution. And that's one of the things I love. I know it's idealistic again, but that is one of the things I love about space exploration. It is a big enough goal that we are uniting countries around the world to bring their pieces, their efforts, their contributions to accomplish them. And I think that brings great hope.
That was a great answer, yeah. Margaret, your thoughts?
I think it really, continues with when Gene Roddenberry was asked later in his life about the success of Star Trek. I think one of his answers was always that, people like the optimism, people like the, more utopian vision of who humanity could be, rather than the more dystopian visions that you also find in science fiction and space science fiction. So I think this is kind of classically Star Trek in that vein of, appealing to the principles and sticking to those, and then of course, and then having it work. That starts to get other groups in line and see them then, not to ruin it, but they get out.
Great. So I think we're ready to throw it out to you guys in the audience. I think we have microphones here on either side. Just put up your hands and we'll bring a microphone to you. And I think we'll start with down here. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Ben. And for me, modern space exploration has largely mirrored that of the Star Trek universe, where it kind of transcends individual desires and is more about kind of collective effort and countries and nation states. Increasingly, there is more and more a commercial aspect to space flight, whether it's just in the economics of finding a new way to move things along, but look at what Elon Musk is proposing, and I certainly understand there are transcendent goals behind his mission, but ultimately it seems as though there is going to be more of that type of shift, and I'm wondering what you think of that, in particular because it seems to be different from perhaps how Star Trek has portrayed the future of how we get there as a species or as a planet.
Do you want to take this, Jeremy?
Sure. So, I see two aspects to that. I mean, commercial industry has been involved in space for a long time. So, initially government started, space satellites, and using space for communication, for example. And then eventually industry took that over, and government largely got out of the business of communication satellites. And that's kind of the goal of government. For the Canadian Space Agency, that's what we look for. We look for what areas of space are we trying to buy down the risk until it gets to the point that an industry can just take it over. And so I agree with what you're saying. In fact, I'm super excited to see this shift that you're talking about in human spaceflight. Now that commercial industry is getting involved in human spaceflight, this marks a turning point. And it means things are going to get cheaper and we're going to be doing more of it. And for astronauts, that's good. That's good for business. And I think it's good for humanity because there's going to be more and more people that will travel to space. In the next decade, a little bit more, but I think in the decade following that, we're going to see a rapid change in that, and that's pretty exciting to me. But it doesn't mean that we won't continue the model that we've had. I think we will. I mean, in our minds, this will free up government space agencies from access to space and allow us to move on to interplanetary travel in our solar system, and that's where we'll focus next. And we don't necessarily see that. We believe we will have to pave the way. The government agencies will have to buy down that risk of interplanetary travel before commercial entities take that over. And then hopefully by that time we'll have our warp drives and we'll head on out to some new solar systems.
Margaret,
Well, I think that's long been the dream. I mean, people have been talking since the 70s and 80s about the idea, and the satellite example is a great one, where that starts as a government initiative and now is, most of the space industry is not the civil human space flight, but there's in fact a large, vibrant corporate world of geosync satellites, communication satellites, and most satellite launch is commercial. So I think the analogy has always been that they hope that this would go the path of analogous things, railroads or airlines that started with a lot of government support and then shifted to a largely self-sustaining business model, and the hope being that if space flight, and especially human space flight, can make that same transition, that it brings down costs that to the extent that one can mitigate the risk, it mitigates the risk. And so I think we're watching not only Elon Musk and SpaceX, but Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin. There are any number of companies, Bigelow, and looking at the space HABs that they have up on the ISS right now as a test module. And so it's something that, as an historian of spaceflight at the Smithsonian, my department is keeps an eye out on where we see these changes happening as we're thinking about, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, what do we need to be collecting in order to record this history?
Great. Where do we have the next question? Down here.
Do you think we'll be able to avoid weaponizing space? There's been a small amount of that, I think, that's already occurred with some satellites that can knock each other out and this type of thing. Do you think I have the will to keep it peaceful?
I'm optimistic. There's no absolutes, and you can't answer that question. It's hard to say where we go. But I think it's calling us to transcend that idea that we need to weaponize space. And I think we're seeing a pretty relevant example right now. We're at a time where it's not very hard to, anybody can look at the global situation right now and realize that the partnerships of the International Space Station are not seeing eye to eye on the ground on other issues. And we've come to the realization, everybody must have come to the realization, that we have too much to lose in this cooperative effort of the International Space Station. And largely what we have decided is that we will all just put a convenient bubble around the space station, and it'll continue business as usual, and the rest of the stuff can carry on as it would carry on. But instead of leveraging the space station as a tool in those, in those diplomatic relations, it just basically got set aside, and we said this doesn't count. And you saw some rhetoric early on in the conflict that people were thinking about using the ISS for leverage, but in the end decided that wasn't the way to go. And I think that's a good symbol for going forward. And I want you to understand something. Even within that bubble of the International Space Station, this is very difficult to do. Like I'm telling you, it's where we see the benefits. We want to continue this model, but boy, it's tough. We do not see, the partner agencies do not see eye to eye on every aspect of space, of running the space station. We really don't. We have to compromise continually, and it's a good exercise. A lot could be learned by the relationships that have formed within the partnership of the International Space Station that could be applied to other aspects of diplomacy.
Next question. Oh, down here. Oh, up here.
Hi, I was wondering what you think that we can learn from Star Trek and maybe the Prime Directive in terms of how to, people are talking about how we're going to maybe colonize Mars in the foreseeable near-ish future. And I'm just thinking that imperialism of Europeans, of basically the entire rest of the world, didn't work out so great. So how could we not make those same mistakes, perhaps?
There are fewer natives on Mars that we have to worry about, which is convenient. But I do think it's going to come back to some of the major themes that Jeremy has been talking about, is that I don't think anyone is thinking about a Mars mission, a boots-on-the-ground human mission, as anything other than something that would be international cooperation. I don't think that any one nation is thinking that they can afford that right now. And the other part of that is trying to think about, as we do scientific exploration, we have a lot of abilities with robotics and to do exploration that I think that science fiction never envisioned. That when some of the early visions of what spaceflight would be they could picture human beings going out and doing this stuff. They couldn't necessarily picture a computer smaller than a room, and they certainly couldn't picture ways to get images other than with film, which meant you had to bring film back. And so when you talk to planetary scientists, they talk a lot about, on the one hand, we've been able to do tremendous science on Mars right now with rovers that are being controlled from Earth on a day-to-day basis. On the other hand, if you talk to the folks who developed those, if you put a human being on Mars, they think they probably could do in about 2 weeks what they've done in months and years with a robot, because a human being just can react and change and is adaptive and creative in ways that that the robot can't be. The robot goes with the instruments that it had when you planned it 10, 15 years ago. As much as we've seen how perilous that can be for Mark Watney in the Martian, but those kinds of questions, I think, are what's going to guide the decisions that eventually might lead to a human mission on Mars, because we're already on Mars, just we don't have boots on the ground there.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is David Kay, and I'm not a huge Star Wars person, but I'm quite Star Trek. You see, right there.
I'm
right
just
there.
glad that I did not make
right
that
there.
mistake. So.
But
fun is fun.
But I'm interested in it, and I'm quite intrigued about the conversation that we had today. And the one conversation that I thought was interesting was how you guys were discussing about the internet, and how the internet is just going all crazy, and it's kind of diplomacy and kind of politics and everything right there. So what I wanted to pass along to all three of you would be, if the internet was Earth, so as in Star Trek, as in is the peaceful point of view, how could we, maybe regulate or help control, or maybe that's not the right word, but to allow a better internet experience or something for each individual, so things are not taking out of it's not taken out of perspective, as like when somebody says something, it'll be meant what they meant instead of being something else.
How do we control the internet?
Yeah.
1 minute, go.
You wouldn't try to control the internet. I think that's the whole point, is you don't control the internet. But what you do is you create a portion of the internet that people come to trust. What needs to happen is, it's what I was going back to. I don't think I ever do. My wife says I never do a good job of explaining this or describing it, that it's confusing the way I say it, but in my mind it makes total sense. But if you could find a way to identify the problems, and for people to, anybody who wanted to contribute, to identify and prioritize the problems, and then identify the solutions, and put this kind of like Wikipedia on steroids, and then have the solutions, almost self-prioritize themselves based on their merit. People can go to a trusted source. It's kind of like I go to Peter Mansbridge. He's a trusted source for me. And that's what I would envision. It's not control, it's just creating a center of excellence within the internet.
The internet is actually one of the examples of something that started as a military and government system, and that has very successfully transitioned into being, it's a self-sustaining tool, which is neither good nor bad nor neutral. And, in fact, I think one of the things, in the realm of, Star Trek is it has allowed communities to form in ways that used to be really constrained by geography. If you were a big fan of something and you couldn't find other folks in your school or in your town who were a big fan of that, it used to be very hard to get to share that experience. And I think through the internet, you not only have, a wealth of, there's a lot of bad information out there, but there's also a wealth of information out there, and there's a wealth of connections that the kind of long tail phenomenon that if you are interested in something that only a few people are interested in, but across the scale of the connectivity that we have, you can find other people who share your interests and hopefully put that into something constructive. So I think it's, it is not neutral. It is about how it's used.
That's actually a good point. Nicholas, have you, since the advent of the internet, have you experienced, as a creator, as part of the Star Trek universe, has that changed how you have been interacting or how fans have been interacting with you in any way? Has it become more, has it brought more fans to you?
I don't know, because I don't keep track of that part of stuff. I'm just like in my own little bubble doing things, but as just a sidebar, and I'll come back to the internet, but art is not a democracy. My job is not to find out what the public want and give it to them. My job is to make the public want what I want. And fans don't know what they want until they get it. If it was up to the fans, Spock never would have died. So you have the right to turn me off, tune me out, dial me, or don't patronize, don't read it, whatever. But if you enter into my universe, then you're along for the ride, and I'm the supreme dictator, and that's how art works. Art is not a democracy. It's not done by committee. It's not done the way Starfleet goes, or the way NASA goes, or or Stronger Together, or whatever. It's about a singular vision that may be influenced by collaboration, but basically it's one person doing the painting. The thing that troubles me with the internet is that it makes no distinction. There's no context to it. Anybody gets on, some jerk gets on and writes anything he wants. One opinion is as good as another. There's no validation between a person with qualifications, with education, with facts at his disposal, and equal time being given to some maniac or maniacs who get on the same way. I mean, I hate to say it, but our entire presidential election at the moment is involving somebody with absolutely no abilities or qualifications who's totally a product of this inability, equal time. And there are scientists who will get out there, and you'll find somebody who will say the Earth is flat, that there is no evolution, that there'll be somebody say global warming, a Chinese hoax, and it'll be disseminated without distinction or without any intercession of, the trusted resource that you were postulating. And I find that terrifying, and not terrifying in the future, terrifying right now.
Okay. We have one more question, I think, up there.
I have one more answer.
Okay.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you for doing this. This has been very interesting to listen to. I do have a question. I think a lot of people are, of course, thinking about the United States election, but even generally speaking, there has to be a way for us as a planet to come back from isolationist policies. And I was wondering if any of you or anyone else has thought about how we should, as a society, move forward and not backward. Because I'm from Eastern Europe, and let me tell you, isolationist policies do not work. Not long term. They are not sustainable. They use fear and cowardice to make people listen to ideals that should not be applied to society at large. But my question is how do we come back from the isolationist policies and from the demagogues and concentrate on what's happening, like global warming, for example?
I'm sorry, where did you say you were from?
I'm from an Eastern European country. I'll say Romania because I'm Romanian.
Well, that's a good reason.
Yeah, behind the Iron Curtain and everything, yeah.
Who'd like to tackle that first?
Well, the one thing that I think is really this notion about coming together. And stopping sort of isolationist sort of reaction. The whole way that democracy works, remember Churchill said that democracy was the least good form of government until you compared it with anyone else. The idea is it's all predicated on education. If you have a democracy is predicated on an enlightened and educated electorate, and the assumption is made that if you are educated, you will make informed decisions about your future and other people, that your vote will make some kind of sense. The problem is, and I think it may have something to do with also how big the country gets, that once you get really, really big, there are so many competing demographic interests that they may cancel each other out. But what happened in America is we seem to have trashed our educational institutions. We are so polarized, and what people can teach, and we don't fund them. We don't pay our teachers properly. They should be paid, way more, and there should be way more teachers in relation to how many students there are. And the result is that I come from a country where there's a lot of know-nothings, where people don't know what it means to be American. They don't know about our revolution. They don't know about George Washington. It's important. And if we don't know who we were, we'll have trouble figuring out who we are. And if we have trouble figuring out who we are, it'll be a hell of a time figuring out where we're going. And then we become frightened. Then we become tribalized into these different things. And then we start fearing the other. We become xenophobic. And then a man on horseback or a Cadillac comes in and says, build a wall. And we go, yeah, the wall, that's going to do it. And people on the internet reinforce it. It's a very dreary prospect. But it all depends to me, as far as I'm concerned, about how educated you are and whether you know things. And one of the things that's also very chilling about the current state in America is the absolute indifference to facts, the absolute reluctance to confront, reality of any kind. Just like ostriches burying your head in the sand. And the more you produce these facts, the deeper the heads go into the sand. And so I don't know the answer to your question, but I sure know the problem. And it's all about education.
All right. I think we'll have one more question. Time for one more question.
Hi, I just wanted to circle back to the Prime Directive because it was a little bit misdefined. The actual Prime Directive in Star Trek is not about not meddling in other civilizations. It's about not meddling with more primitive civilizations than you are. In Star Trek, the delineation they made was like space travel. If a civilization achieved space travel, then they were considered equals. If they haven't, then they were primitive and they should be left alone. And I'm bringing it back to Earth. It's easy to say, like, you should have never interfered with the natives in America. That was catastrophic. But the other side of it is, if you're an advanced civilization, or a primitive civilization that has dying of diseases that you know how to cure, should you interfere and cure them or not? Or just let them die until they figure out a way to fix themselves or not? And so my question is, do you believe the Prime Directive is good? And if so, how do you balance? Should it be absolute? And if not absolute, how do you balance when you should interfere or not?
Thank you. Who would like to?
I think it's very, I'll say this because I'm not an expert, but I play one on TV. It's very hard to find a one-size-fits-all rule, either in science, Einstein kept looking for it, or in civilization, a law without exception, which is to say a law without the capacity for mercy or elasticity. This is a very old human dilemma, is when do you compromise? When do you make exception? When do you break your own rule? It's interesting, the episode that you showed in which this lady who was not at the time starving to death said, I would rather we starve to death than break our rule. Have you ever heard of something called lifeboat diplomacy? They teach it in law schools, and there have been a couple of movies made about it. But basically, a ship goes down, a ship sinks, and a lifeboat is overloaded with people. And this actually happened in 1840 on a ship called the something Brown was where this got started. The Brown, like the Titanic, hit something. It may have been an iceberg. And the lifeboat was loaded to the gunwales with people. And it was a calm sea, but it wasn't going to stay calm forever. And they were faced with a situation in which none of the people could be saved, or some of the people could be saved. And the only way that would happen is by taking some of the people and putting them off the boat. Now, some of the people might have helped by volunteering. But somebody had to make a decision. It was a Norwegian sailor, in reality, who was going to live and who was going to die. And do you, for example, take women and children and say, oh, they're going to stay, and it's the men's job to go overboard, whereas the women, certainly in this example, were going to be less likely to be able to fend for themselves in the boat than men who were trained sailors. So should it be the women and the children who get put over? This is life's, it's a very vexing question. It's not a question that is susceptible of a simple answer. And people were put over the side. And this sailor was put on trial as a murderer. But he could just as well have been exalted as a savior, because he saved the rest. And that in a microcosm for me is the problem with prime directives or anything else that is absolutely immutable. Because there will always be a set of circumstances, I think, that tries you to your foundation about, do you help or do you not? Do we go into Bosnia to try to save people who are we the policeman or are we not the policeman? When people in the boat, and planet Earth is the boat, are loaded to the gunwales, can we save some of the people? Can we save none of the people? Who makes these decisions? What makes them right? What are the criteria? This is not a simple world.
Any thoughts from you, Margaret?
I'm just reflecting on, I think, I'm often asked why the National Air and Space Museum at the Smithsonian has such an interest in imaginary spaceships and how spaceflight has been imagined. And I think it's because the power of this art form to ask these big questions not only informs our understanding of the space and the science technologies, but gets us grappling with some of these really fundamental questions. And I was just reflecting on, that we've talked about the internet, we've talked about, lifeboat diplomacy, that we have talked about, isolationist politics, or, the current presidential, that the coming into a conversation about, Star Trek and diplomacy has then just ballooned out into, questions of planetary exploration. And for me, then, when I'm trying to, justify why it is that I think, an imaginary spaceship deserves a place in a hall with other very real vehicles, I think it's because it raises some of these very big questions and shows the way that the science and technology that we exhibit is also always in these larger social, political, cultural, economic contexts and asking these really big fundamental questions.
Isn't the shuttle, the original prototype of the shuttle, wasn't it called Enterprise?
It was named Enterprise in response to a fan writing campaign in the 70s, yes.
Jeremy, final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciated your comments about how there's no absolutes, and answering a question like that, and there can't be. And if you look back, I mean, we've made a mess so many times with our concepts of righteousness And you acknowledged the First Nations territory here, and it's something that we'll hear more and more of as we start to truly understand, some of the errors and mistakes that we've made in the past, and how we have to correct them. I think that's really important, and these need to be reminders for us going forward that you need to be, like you were saying, you need to be very educated before you step into a situation and ask yourself some hard questions. And I can't answer that question other than to say that there's a couple of things that would guide me that I would ask. I would ask, am I being asked to provide help? Have I been invited? And am I really bringing value for them, or am I driven by bringing value to me? And those would be a couple of guiding principles.
I think those are good guiding principles for all of us. Thank you so much for a really enlightening and entertaining discussion as well. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Jeremy. I'd like to give them a hand. And just a note, we'll have 2 more Trek Talks coming up. On November 2nd, we welcome theoretical physicist and cosmologist Lawrence Krauss for a presentation on Star Trek and science. And on December 5th, we welcome Mae Jemison, former NASA astronaut, for a presentation on Star Trek and the future. And now, I would like to thank our panelists again. And before you leave, or as you leave, please take a look at our screen. We'll have a message from our friends at CBS about a few things that you can buy around the Star Trek universe as well. Enjoy, and thanks so much for being here tonight. We look forward to seeing you at the next Trek Talk.
Space.
Space. Space.
The final frontier.
These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise.
Enterprise.
Enterprise. Her ongoing mission to explore strange new worlds. To seek out new life and new civilizations.
To boldly go.
To boldly go. To boldly go where no man has gone before.
Celebrate 50 years of Star Trek.
Cheers.
With the limited edition gift set, get 30 Blu-ray discs featuring the original show and movies with the original crew, plus the animated series for the first time on Blu-ray, along with a 2-hour multi-part documentary. And available in this gift set, get a 50th anniversary badge, 6 mini movie posters, and hours of special features.
Is that all you gotta say?
And experience the Wrath of Khan Director's Cut. On Blu-ray for the first time ever, including nearly 30 minutes of new bonus content.
I would not presume to debate you. That is wise.
And for the first time in new ultra-slim Blu-ray sets, Star Trek, the complete original series, and the Next Generation complete series.
Sophisticated technology.
Resistance is futile.
Surrender and prepare to be boarded.
That will be the day.
Fire.
Add to your Star Trek collection.
Let's make sure that history never forgets the name Enterprise.
Available on Blu-ray today. And look for Star Trek and Star Trek Into Darkness. Available for the first time in stunning 4K Ultra HD. Plus, don't miss Star Trek Beyond, coming soon on Blu-ray and digital HD.